Beneath the castles and cathedrals of the Middle Ages, there were places no sunlight ever touched. Damp air pressed against stone walls, slick with centuries of rot. The floor was cold, carved from rock, stained dark by things long forgotten. The dungeon was not a prison in the modern sense. It was a stage for pain, a theater of fear, a chamber where silence itself was broken by screams. Iron shackles dangled from the walls, rust biting into the wrist of those who once wore them. Chains rattled like restless ghosts, and the stench of blood clung to the air. Torches flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. Here flesh was torn not by accident, but by design. Agony was measured carefully, stretched over hours, sometimes days. Each cry of torment was a message to the world above, obedience or this fate. The dungeon was a place where humanity was stripped away, and only terror remained. Walls do not speak, but if these stones could talk, they would tell tales soaked in blood and betrayal. Stories of rulers who ruled through fear, of priests who claimed holy justice, of prisoners who vanished into darkness without a trace. But these are not just legends carved in whispers. They are truths buried in stone, waiting to be unearthed. And what lies deeper in these medieval dungeons is far more horrific than you could ever imagine. Torture in the medieval world was never random. It was a system carefully woven into the fabric of law, religion, and power. Kings and lords did not build dungeons merely to hold prisoners. They built them to control hearts, to silence dissent, and to remind everyone that authority was absolute. Fear was a currency, more valuable than gold, and nothing purchased obedience faster than the memory of screams. When a man disappeared into the depths of a dungeon, his family understood the message. When he emerged broken, scarred, or sometimes not at all, the lesson spread further than any decree or proclamation. Pain reached places that words never could. The dungeon was not just underground. It was beneath society itself, a shadow realm propping up the world above. Every stone, every iron chain carried the weight of power disguised as justice. Rulers called it order. Priests called it purification. But for those chained in the dark, it was neither. It was terror, raw and unending, and the methods of that terror were as varied as the rulers who wielded them. Devices crafted not for swift death, but for slow destruction. Instruments designed to stretch the body, crush the bones, or pierce the flesh with merciless precision. They were not tools of war, but tools of control. This was the hidden heartbeat of medieval authority, echoing not in words or laws, but in cries of agony. And yet, what you have heard so far is only the foundation. For when we descend into the First Kingdom's infamous dungeons, the secrets grow darker, the blood runs thicker, and the true horrors finally begin. In England, the dungeon was not a myth, it was a symbol. Few places captured its essence more than the Tower of London. Rising over the Thames like a fortress of power, its stone walls promised safety for the crown above, and despair for the souls trapped below. To be taken to the tower was not simply arrest. It was a sentence written in shadows. The tower's dungeons became infamous as holding grounds for nobles, traitors, and enemies of the throne. Here, chains were fastened to ankles heavy with betrayal. Here, walls heard confessions wrung from lips by agony rather than truth. Some cells were so narrow, a prisoner could not stretch. Others were so damp, the air itself seemed to choke. But the tower was more than a place of confinement. It was a theater of punishment. Prisoners were stretched on the racks, their joints pulled until bones threatened to tear apart. Others were pressed under crushing weight, iron slowly grinding the breath from their lungs. Each device had one purpose: to turn defiance into obedience, to show all England that the crown's will was unbreakable. Yet even in such darkness, rumors grew. Stories of screams drifting across the river at night. Tales of figures wandering the corridors, as if the pain of the past had never died. The tower stones became stained with memory, a monument not only to kings and queens, but to the suffering they demanded. And still, this was only one dungeon among many. For across the seas in Spain, another kind of darkness took root, where faith and fire twisted together, and torture became a holy command. In Spain, the dungeon was more than a prison. It became an instrument of faith. Beneath monasteries and cathedrals, chambers of stone were prepared not for worship, but for suffering. Here, the Spanish Inquisition unfolded its dark rituals, cloaked in the language of salvation. To the outside world, these trials promised justice for heresy. But in the shadows, justice was drowned by screams. The Inquisition sought confession, and confession was a prize torn from flesh. Men and women accused of straying from the church were dragged into narrow cells, blindfolded, shackled, and made to kneel in silence while priests questioned their souls. The silence rarely lasted. Soon came the hiss of ropes tightening, the drip of water from a bucket, the iron scent of chains warmed by human skin. The most infamous of their tools was the strappado. A prisoner's arms were bound behind their back and fastened to a rope. With a sudden pull, they were lifted high, shoulders tearing from their sockets, then dropped just short of the ground. The shock shattered bone, the pain splintered the will, and yet the cycle repeated again and again until words, true or false, poured from their mouths. Another torment was the rack, stretched long and merciless. Joints cracked like branches under strain. The body writhed, elongated until tendons threatened to snap. Few resisted beyond the first turn of the wheel. Those who did were left shattered, their confessions soaked in blood and agony. And then came water torture, deceptively simple yet devastating. A cloth was forced into the mouth. Water poured until the victim gasped in terror, drowning without drowning. To the church, this was purification. To the victim, it was hell drawn out in choking gulps. The Inquisition claimed these methods brought truth into the light. But what emerged from those dungeons was not truth. It was survival, spoken through sobs and broken breath. For those accused, innocence or guilt mattered little. Once inside, every path led to pain. And when confession finally came, it was less a choice than a surrender carved into the soul. Yet Spain was not alone in such horrors. Across Europe, from villages gripped by fear to kingdoms ruled by suspicion, dungeons multiplied like shadows. And in France, during the frenzy of witch trials, cruelty reached new heights, as torture became the key to unlocking confessions no one could ever truly give. In France, the dungeon became the stage for one of the darkest dramas of the Middle Ages, the witch hunts. Fear of the devil spread like fire through towns and villages. Whispers of sorcery, curses, and secret pacts with demons were enough to drag men and women from their homes into the depths of stone chambers. Once inside, there was little hope of escape. Guilt was not decided by evidence. It was forced out through pain. The accused were confronted not with reason, but with instruments of agony. One such device was the Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat sharp at its peak, where the victim was lowered, bound by ropes, their own weight becoming the weapon. Hours, sometimes days, of excruciating pressure tore both body and spirit apart. This was not justice. It was a ritualized torment, dressed as divine duty. Another terror was the pear of anguish. Inserted into the mouth, or for women accused of consorting with the devil, into more intimate places, it was then expanded by a screw, tearing flesh slowly, deliberately. Every turn was a sentence of pain, every scream proof to the inquisitors that evil had taken root. The cries of the tortured echoed far beyond the dungeon walls, infecting whole villages with dread. But the cruelty did not stop there. Witch hunts demanded confessions, and confessions demanded more blood. Some were bound to chairs of iron, heated over fire until flesh blistered and smoke filled the air. Others were crushed beneath stones, weight piled heavier with each refusal to admit guilt. And for those who finally confessed, the dungeon was only the beginning. Death awaited above in the market square, where fire devoured what torture had already broken. What made these trials even more chilling was their paradox. The church and crown declared they were protecting society from evil. But the greater evil was hidden in plain sight, in the torment inflicted by human hands, sanctified by fear and superstition. Ordinary people watched neighbors burned, friends condemned, and families destroyed, all under the guise of cleansing the land of witches. The witch hunts of France left scars that still haunt history. Innocence was no shield, and silence was no defense. In the dungeons, pain replaced truth, and every confession written in agony was accepted as holy proof. And yet, France was not alone in its obsession with control through cruelty. For in Germany, another symbol of terror was born, one that would become infamous across centuries. The Iron Maiden, a coffin of steel, spikes, and silence, waiting to embrace its victims. In Germany, the dungeon held its own grim invention, a device that would become the very symbol of medieval cruelty, the Iron Maiden. To the outside eye, it appeared almost regal, shaped like a coffin carved in the form of a woman, tall and imposing, with a face cold and expressionless. But behind the steel mask lurked horror. When its doors closed, the embrace of the maiden was lined not with comfort, but with spikes. Victims were forced inside, pressed into an upright coffin, arms and legs trapped by the iron shell. The doors creaked shut, slow and deliberate, until the spikes pierced flesh. Rarely fatal in an instant, the wounds were shallow but many, designed not to kill quickly, but to torment. Blood trickled down, pooling at the feet, as air grew heavy and dark. Trapped inside, the prisoner was alone with the suffocating silence, broken only by their own ragged breath. The Iron Maiden was never about swift justice. It was about spectacle, about striking fear into every witness who heard the screams from within. Legends tell of prisoners surviving hours, even days, bleeding slowly in the dark. Some whispered that guards placed candles inside, their flames devouring oxygen until suffocation became the final act. Whether every tale is true or not, the maiden's reputation was enough. Its name carried terror across Europe, long after its doors closed on the last victim. But the maiden was not Germany's only cruelty. Dungeons across the region used the breaking wheel, where bodies were tied and shattered under the weight of hammers, bones splintered piece by piece. Others spoke of chairs studded with iron spikes, heated until flesh sizzled against metal. Each device was an invention of precision, crafted to extend agony rather than end it. What makes these tools so haunting is not only their existence, but their intent. They were built not in haste, but with care, designed by human hands, engineered to cause fear beyond death. Every bolt, every blade, every spike was a reminder that pain was a science, refined over centuries. And yet, Germany was only one stage in a much larger theater of torment. In Italy, another form of dungeon awaited, one where the power of the church cloaked cruelty in the language of salvation, and where the line between faith and fear blurred into a darkness even deeper. In Italy, the dungeon was not only the domain of kings and nobles, it belonged to the church as well. Beneath monasteries and cathedrals, hidden behind walls adorned with frescoes and saints, lay chambers of stone where mercy was scarce and faith became a weapon. Here, the authority of God and the cruelty of men merged into one. These religious dungeons were cloaked in silence. Priests in robes of black and crimson would descend narrow staircases carrying torches, their shadows stretching like specters across the walls. The accused, heretics, blasphemers, or those who simply defied the church, were dragged down into the cold. Once inside, the holy words of forgiveness faded, replaced by chains and screams. Among the most feared punishments was the holy chair. To the eye, it looked simple, a wooden seat, but every surface bristled with iron spikes. On the backrest, the armrests, the seat itself. The prisoner was forced to sit, strapped in so that the points bit into flesh. Some versions of the chair were heated with fire from below, each breath filling the air with smoke and the stench of burning skin. Priests called it purification. Victims called it hell. There were also stories of the mask of shame, iron visages shaped into grotesque expressions, locked onto the faces of the condemned. Some bore spikes on the inside, silencing the tongue, cutting whenever the victim tried to speak. Worn for hours or days, they turned humiliation into agony, a punishment meant not only to wound, but to destroy dignity. What made Italy's religious dungeons so chilling was the contradiction they embodied. Above ground, the church spoke of salvation, forgiveness, and eternal life. Below ground, faith was enforced with steel and fire. Those who entered the dungeons prayed for redemption. But what they found was torment, sanctified in God's name. And yet, even as Italy's chambers of faith consumed the accused, not all punishments remained hidden in shadows. Some left the darkness of the dungeon and spilled out into the open streets. For across Europe, pain became a public lesson, an example staged before the crowd, where the spectacle of suffering was meant to bind society together through fear. Not all pain was hidden behind stone walls. In medieval Europe, torture often stepped out of the dungeon and onto the streets, transforming agony into public theater. The crowd became both witness and judge, their eyes feeding the power of those who staged the spectacle. If the dungeon whispered fear in the dark, public punishment screamed it beneath the open sky. The marketplace or town square became the stage. Wooden scaffolds were erected, ropes swung from beams, and platforms dripped with the memory of blood. The condemned were dragged from their cells, shackles clanging against cobblestones, their faces pale but resigned. The public awaited not justice, but entertainment. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders. Merchants paused their trade. Even priests stood among the crowd, blessing the scene before it unfolded. One of the most common displays was flogging. Stripped to the waist, a prisoner was whipped until flesh opened in crimson lines. The sound of leather against skin echoed through the streets, a rhythm of obedience. Each strike was not just for the victim, but for every onlooker, an unspoken reminder of what awaited defiance. For greater crimes, the punishments grew harsher. Some were placed in the pillory, heads and hands locked in wooden boards, left exposed to the mockery and abuse of neighbors. Rotten food, stones, and filth rained down until humiliation broke them as surely as pain. Others faced mutilation, ears, noses, even tongues severed before a cheering audience, the wounds meant to mark them forever as examples. And then there were executions, hanging, beheading, burning. These were not carried out quietly. They were staged with precision, designed to etch terror into memory. In some towns, the condemned were broken on the wheel, limbs shattered one by one as the crowd gasped and cried. In others, they were burned alive, their screams rising with the smoke, meant to show the fire of justice consuming sin itself. The difference between dungeon and street was not in cruelty, but in purpose. The dungeon isolated pain, using darkness to extract secrets and break spirits. Public punishment displayed it, using light to spread fear far and wide. Together, they formed a system, a cycle of hidden torment and visible warning, ensuring that power reached every corner of society. But cruelty did not stop at the square. In the workshops of executioners and jailers, strange devices were crafted, tools of steel and wood, built with terrifying imagination. And in these instruments, we find the most haunting truth of all, that human hands designed suffering as carefully as they built cathedrals. In the heart of every dungeon, there was silence and the sound of machines waiting to be used. Instruments of torture were not crude. They were crafted with care, built by blacksmiths who forged tools of war and then turned their skills to a darker purpose. These were not weapons designed to kill quickly. They were devices of control, built to stretch time, to draw out every moment of agony until the victim was no longer a person, but a lesson. The rack was perhaps the most infamous. A long wooden frame, ropes tied to wrists and ankles, turned by wheels that pulled the body in opposite directions. With each rotation, joints cracked, tendons tore, bones strained until they splintered. Victims often begged for death long before it came. The rack did not seek confession. It demanded surrender, carving pain into every inch of the body until the will itself collapsed. Then there was the scavenger's daughter, a cruel counterpart to the rack. Instead of stretching, it crushed. The victim was forced into a crouch position, iron bands tightening around head, arms and legs, until blood burst from nose and ears. Unlike the rack's drawn-out agony, this device compacted suffering into silence, folding the body in on itself as if to erase it. The breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel, was another spectacle of terror. Prisoners were tied across its spokes, their limbs smashed with hammers until bones shattered like glass. Sometimes the broken body was left displayed on the wheel, birds pecking at the remains, a grim warning for anyone who dared to disobey. It was torture, made eternal, even after life had ended. There were smaller devices too, each designed with a twisted imagination. Thumbscrews that crushed bone inch by inch. The boot, which splintered shins as wedges drove deeper with every strike. The heretic's fork, a double-pronged metal rod strapped beneath the chin and chest, forcing the victim's head upwards so that even the smallest movement carved flesh. None of these tools killed quickly. That was never the goal. The goal was obedience, compliance, and the spreading of fear. What makes these inventions most haunting is not their brutality, but the precision behind them. They reveal how cruelty was studied, refined, and perfected as if it were an art. Each device was a blueprint of suffering, a design meant to break both body and soul. But instruments were only part of the horror. Within the dungeon walls, the prisoners themselves carried stories far darker than the tools. Their cries, their madness, their silence, all became echoes that refused to die. And in those echoes, we glimpse the true terror of the dungeon. Not the machines, but the human heart that survived or failed to survive them. If the dungeon's devices broke the body, the dungeon itself broke the mind. Long before chains were fastened or the rack was turned, terror began in silence. Prisoners were dragged through stone corridors, torches casting shadows that stretched like grasping hands. They were pushed into cells barely large enough to stand, the air thick with mold, dampness dripping from ceilings, rats scurrying across the floor. The body could endure for a time. The mind unraveled much faster. Darkness was a weapon. Hours and days passed without light. The human eye strained, desperate for shapes until shadows became monsters. The brain, starved of stimulation, began to invent horrors, replaying screams from neighboring cells, real or imagined. Some prisoners clawed at the walls, convinced they were closing in. Others whispered prayers until their voices broke, certain that no God could hear them beneath the earth. Isolation was as cruel as any spike or chain. Weeks could stretch into months with no human voice but the echo of the jailer's footsteps. In that silence, the weight of despair crushed harder than iron. Men who once defied kings with words and armies were reduced to trembling figures rocking in corners, begging for any voice, even the voice of their torturer. And when torture did come, it arrived as both a horror and a relief. For some, the pain ended the endless waiting. For others, it confirmed that hope was gone. Prisoners often confessed before a hand was laid upon them, not because guilt burned in their hearts, but because fear already hollowed them out. The dungeon did not need to break bones to break a spirit. Sometimes darkness alone was enough. Yet the worst terror was uncertainty. The prisoner never knew when the door would creak open. Would it be food, a question whispered by a priest, or the executioner with tools in hand? That waiting was its own form of torment, a clock with no hours, a sentence with no end. In the end, many prisoners left their cells only in madness. Some muttered to unseen figures. Others walked to their deaths with vacant eyes, already broken long before the fire or the sword. The dungeon consumed not just bodies, but identities. It swallowed names, stories, and memories, leaving only hollow echoes in the stone. But even as individual minds shattered in the dark, the legacy of these dungeons did not fade. For the blood spilled within their walls seeped into history itself, staining the memory of an entire age. And that memory still lingers, etched into stories, legends, and fears that survive even today. And so, the question remains, how could a world so devoted to faith, honor, and order build monuments of such cruelty? The answer lies not only in the stones of the dungeon, but in the legacy they left behind. A legacy we still cannot escape. The dungeons of the Middle Ages were not erased when their doors closed. They lived on, in stories, in memories, in the way entire generations came to understand power and fear. The very word dungeon still sends a chill down the spine, echoing with centuries of terror. These chambers were more than prisons. They became symbols, carved deep into the imagination of Europe. Chroniclers of the time recorded fragments, often in whispers, sometimes in coded words, of what they had seen or heard. Tales of noblemen vanishing into the tower, of heretics swallowed by the Inquisition's cells, of women branded as witches whose screams were muffled beneath church floors. Even when evidence was scarce, the story spread, traveling from mouth to mouth like shadows moving through the streets. Fear needed little proof. It thrived on silence and suggestion. As centuries passed, these stories transformed into legends. Writers painted the dungeons as the underworld of their age, places where justice became cruelty and law turned into tyranny. Playwrights and poets filled their works with chains, torches, and iron masks. Pain became theater not only for those who suffered, but for those who read, watched, and remembered. By the Renaissance, the dungeon had already become a dark mirror, reflecting the brutality hidden beneath civilization's surface. Even in modern times, the image endures. Gothic novels brought back the dripping walls and secret chambers. Horror films turned the dungeon into a labyrinth of nightmares. Role-playing games and fantasy stories still use the word dungeon as shorthand for danger, darkness, and fear. Though centuries have passed, the symbol remains as sharp as the spikes once driven into flesh. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is not in books or films. It is in the way we still associate stone walls and barred doors with oppression. The dungeon became the template for prisons, the embodiment of punishment. Its memory shaped how societies conceived of justice and control. And even as chains gave way to iron bars, the fear they represented never truly disappeared. The dungeon is no longer a physical place for most of us, yet its blood-soaked secrets survive, not as relics of the past, but as warnings. They remind us that cruelty can hide behind law, that torture can wear the mask of justice, that faith can be twisted into a blade. The stones are silent now, but their silence is heavy. It speaks across centuries, whispering truths we might prefer to ignore. And still, we are not at the darkest part of the story. For when we step back and see the pattern across kingdoms, we realize the dungeon was never an exception. It was a system, widespread, calculated, universal. And in that realization, we find the true horror, that no corner of medieval life was untouched by its shadow. When we step back from the walls of a single dungeon, a darker pattern emerges. Torture was not confined to one kingdom, one religion, or one ruler. It was universal. From the courts of England to the cells of Spain, from the witch hunts of France to the iron coffins of Germany, pain was written into the very foundation of power. No culture of the medieval world was free from its shadow. To understand the Middle Ages, we must understand this. Authority was not secured by words alone. It was reinforced through fear. Kings issued decrees. Priests preached sermons. But it was the dungeon that gave those commands teeth. The memory of agony spread faster than any royal order, burning itself into the minds of entire populations. A crown gleamed brighter when supported by chains. A cross carried more weight when accompanied by fire. Torture was more than cruelty. It was communication. A man stretched on the rack spoke to thousands who never saw him. A woman burned in the square whispered warnings to every household for miles. The message was simple: obedience or destruction. This was how rulers built empires that endured, not through love or loyalty, but through the shared terror of their subjects. And yet, perhaps the most chilling truth is that torture was accepted. Crowds gathered to watch. Priests blessed the rituals. Families whispered stories that kept children in line. The dungeon was not hidden from society. It was part of it, woven into its rhythm like harvests, festivals, and wars. Fear was not just imposed. It was normalized, expected, and passed down through generations. This is why the dungeon endures as a symbol. It represents not only what was done to the few, but what was felt by the many. The tools may have varied, the rituals may have changed, but the logic remained the same: break one and control thousands. Each civilization refined the art, but all spoke the same language, the language of suffering. And so, when we look across the ruins of medieval Europe, we see more than castles and cathedrals. We see an invisible network of chambers and chains, binding together an age through blood and fear. These were not isolated horrors. They were the architecture of power itself. But even as the Middle Ages ended, and light began to shine into the dark corners of history, one question remained. Did humanity truly leave the dungeon behind? Or did its shadow simply learn to wear a different mask? The medieval dungeon may seem like a relic, buried in stone and shadow. Its chains are rusted, its walls silent, its torches long extinguished. We imagine its horrors as something distant, something belonging to an age of superstition and cruelty far removed from our own. But history is not so easily buried. The echoes of the dungeon have followed us, whispering through the centuries, shaping the ways we punish, control, and fear. Prisons today are built with steel instead of stone, but the intent is not always so different. Solitary confinement echoes the isolation of the medieval cell. The fear of state power, the silence of those disappeared into hidden rooms, recalls the same terror that once haunted castle basements. Even the idea that pain can reveal truth, once the justification of the rack or the strappado, lingers in modern debates about interrogation. We tell ourselves we have moved on. But the shadow of the dungeon lingers at the edge of our vision. The legacy is not only physical, but psychological. The very concept of punishment as spectacle still survives. We may not gather in the square to watch a wheel turn or a fire burn, but we consume suffering in other forms, through screens, through stories, through the fascination with crime and cruelty that has never left us. We still seek to understand the darkest parts of ourselves by staring into them, just as crowds once stared into the flames of execution. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. The dungeon was not only a place, it was a mirror. It showed humanity the lengths to which it would go to maintain power, to silence dissent, to feed fear. That mirror has not shattered. It waits, hidden in plain sight, reminding us that civilization and barbarity are never as far apart as we like to believe. So when we walk past castle ruins or visit museums where rusted chains hang silently, we are not only looking at the past, we are looking at ourselves, at what we were, at what we are capable of, and perhaps at what we may become again. Because the question that history leaves us with is not whether the dungeons were real. It is whether they are truly gone, or whether, in ways we do not wish to admit, we are still living in their shadow.